Hello and welcome again to another lovely session of Civil Engineering with Tanya J. Laird. I'm the aforementioned Tanya J. Laird. This lecture is the first in my wood design series. I've decided to title this lecture, Let's Talk About Trees. This video is going to focus on the physical structure of trees and how this impacts our work as structural engineers. I'm going to discuss some information on the biology and growth of trees and what impact that has on wood as a structural material. Wood as a biological material has many interesting complications and complexities, and as a structural engineer, you need to be aware of these when you're designing wooden structures. This is a walnut. This is a walnut tree. Walnut, walnut tree. Walnut, walnut tree. These are pine cones. These are pine trees. Pine cones, pine trees. Obviously, the fundamental difference between these two things is one is the seed form of the plant and one is the final adult form of the plant after years of growth. So how do we go from this to this? Well, we go through a certain growth process. And why is that important? Well, as structural engineers, this is not useful to us. These are not very useful to us. They're useful for some people, for lots of different trees produce useful, fruits and nuts and berries and all sorts of lovely things. But as structural engineers, these are not useful to us. These are. And it is important to know how and to learn how trees go from this to this and what that growth process looks like, because ultimately that has impact on wood as a structural material. Let's talk a bit about how trees develop and grow. A key thing to keep in mind is that trees are alive. They are living organisms, well, at least before we turn them into building products. They are alive, but they are definitely not animals. So while they do have cellular structure, and they do have all the characteristics of a living organism, they are not ambulatory, they're not mobile. Their interior organ structure, well, they don't really have organ structure, their interior makeup and composition and cellular structure ultimately add a lot or contribute a lot to their final material properties. So here is a basic, biology, grade school biology type diagram of a plant cell. So their cells, of course, are plant cells, and like all plant cells, they have distinct cellular walls, as labeled here. Now, if you remember back to your grade school biology or your college biology, you'll remember that, in contrast, animal cells will have a much more porous and less rigid cell membrane. The typical cell wall is much more rigid than the typical cell membrane. So that already gives us a hint of how wood obtained some of its strength is from the cell walls in the structure. And then additionally, in wood cells, these cells are stretched out axially, so they're not nice and simple and square around. They're actually very long. The typical cells that give wood structure are very long cells, and their length is stretched out along the grain of the wood, and in the trunk of a tree that will typically run vertically, and in the branches of a tree that will typically run along with the branch, although there are some exceptions, of course. And when I say stretched out, I simply mean that the diameter of the tree cells is much less than the length of them. Another thing to keep in mind is that trees lack the complex circulatory systems found in animals. Even something like an insect, which has very simple circulatory systems, a very simple circulatory system is much more complex than what a plant will have for distributing material around it, nutrients, food, water, etc. At least in terms of active management. There aren't a tree obviously has no heart, it has no lungs, it has no veins, although it does have places that water can travel through, as we'll discuss. But they can't actively pump water and other nutrients around their bulk by active measures. Instead, they rely on osmotic root pressure and internal capillary action to move water about their interiors. Because of these properties, trees are not able to grow and develop the way animals can. Once a wood cell is laid down, it can't be unlaid by that tree. Again, once a wood cell has grown, it can't be recycled or ungrown. Contrast this with animals. Animals can, in certain cases, heal interior damage by growing new cells internally. A prime example of this, or a famous example of this, is the liver. Under the right conditions, the human liver can regenerate to a certain degree. If a portion of the liver is removed, even a large portion in certain cases, then the remaining liver cells can regenerate the missing portion. The same can happen more commonly with muscles. If you are involved in a long period or in long periods of heavy exercise, such as weight training, you can grow new muscle cells as needed. Or on the opposite end of the fitness spectrum, you might find yourself growing new fat cells. In either case, the body must grow new and expand existing veins and arteries to support the new tissues. You can't just place new muscle cells, for example, in a muscle, because the existing circulatory system, the veins, arteries, etc., are sized to provide the needs of the existing tissues. So you can't just add more tissues there without also supplying them. And so if you want to add more cells or more tissues, you need to in turn add more support, more circulatory system components. And all of this is possible because of the body's flexibility and its ability to move nutrients about it. So existing tissues can move and shift to accommodate new cells and veins. Stem cells can move about the body, transforming into the required cells when needed for the growth process. This, of course, can't happen with a tree. Remember, a tree has rigid cells that are with rigid cell walls that are fixed and immovable. Once a layer of cells has been grown, the tree can't come back later and decide that it wants to place something else there. It is a permanent process when a tree grows a new cell, and it can't just change its mind about it later. So this sort of locking in is really a key to trees' ultimate strength as a material, of course, ultimate strength as a material, but it is also key to how they grow and develop. Since a tree can't remove old cells, then how does a tree actually grow? So as a human grows from infant to adult, bones and muscles can grow with tissue shifting as necessary. Since this can't happen with a tree, it instead has to grow in a particular way. And that particular way is that a tree grows from the inside out. So if we have, let's see here, we have some ground. And a tree like any plant starts out as a small seedling. And I'm going to ignore leaves right here because, as we'll talk about later, those will tend to fall off each year, especially particularly with deciduous trees. But let's just look at an idealized case. And ignoring leaves, looking at just branches, stems, trunks, etc. So we start with a small seedling. And again, trees can only grow upward and outward. They can only grow from the inside out. So when a tree wants to go and make itself larger, when a tree first sprouts, it has this little sprout coming out of the ground. Then it wants to grow larger. It instead of removing old cells, it will grow a new layer around the outside. So we'll get a new layer of growth. Then, maybe next year or later on, we will get another layer of growth. Then eventually we'll get another layer of growth, and another layer of growth, and another layer of growth. Now, you're probably saying that doesn't look much like a tree, and that's because this isn't really drawn to scale. In reality, it's more something like this, where it's much more stretched out. So you have layers growing like this, etc., etc. All this same kind of layering process, except much more longitudinal than in a simple mound type shape like this. I haven't really seen many trees that are shaped like just piles of sand. Anyway, this also extends to branches. So at a particular time, if a branch buds off, you'll start with a very small branch. And then then when the tree continues to grow, that branch will start getting its own layering process. And then that will go like that, another layer on the trunk going all the way like this. Then again, the branch can grow longer and it can grow wider, but it can't actually change any of the old material. And a new layer can grow. Hopefully it's not as lumpy as my drawing here, but a new layer can grow. And then the next year, a new layer can grow. Like this. Actually, I should probably draw the branch first, well, they both grow at the same time, so I should probably actually be drawing this as one continuous layer. But then a new layer grows all the way around here. And see, what we end up with then is that we end up with a branch actually extending deep into the actual core of the tree. And this is ultimately responsible for many things we see in wood. If you wonder where knots in wood come from, and we'll talk about that later, knots in trees come from this process. If you cut boards out of this tree trunk here, this section right here where you have a tree branch extending into the wood, you will end up with a knot because from the grain direction of the branch. Again, trees grow from the inside out, and ultimately this is what produces the grain patterns in wood and also the ring structure that you're probably familiar with. Here's another example, this one from Wikipedia. So what this is an idealized rendering or an idealized sketch of what the internal growth layers of a tree look like. And notice again, branches, stem, and roots thicken each year. So you can see here that this tree branch here started off as a much narrower branch, and as the tree laid down layers each year, it doesn't lay down separate root and trunk layers, it just lays down a continuous layer all the way along its outside. So if you trace this layer here, you can see that it actually goes all the way around the drawing. Again, different branches are laid down at different times or start growing at different times, but each year you can sort of conceptualize it as a tree growing a certain amount of new surface every year. And if we were to take a cross section of this, we can now see where the characteristic famous ring structure of trees comes from. Each ring in a tree is basically the accumulated growth from a single year. And also, but I didn't mention this in the previous drawing for brevity, but here we can see that this sort of same growth process also extends beneath the soil. In the roots of a tree grow the exact same way. You have layer after layer after layer being laid down a little bit each year, and so you end up with the roots that also have a ring structure, just like you have a ring structure in your trunks and in your branches. Now let's talk about the actual layers inside a tree. So a tree does grow from the inside out, but as given layers develop and age, it does produce a characteristic structure inside the tree. So on the very outside of a tree, of course, you're going to have your bark. And this is just an idealized drawing of a tree. Then you're going to have a thin layer, and and there is both an inner bark and an outer bark. The outer bark is the part that's visible, and I would say the bark is about from here to here. And there is an inner bark and an outer bark. The outer bark is the part that you actually see. It's the outermost surface of the tree, and the inner bark, if you actually separate that from a tree and lay it on a sheet and dry it out, that's actually how cork is made. Then on the inside here, you notice that you have increasingly darkening wood as you move toward the center, and these other layers, they exist, but where they begin and end can be a little fuzzy. But the key thing to be aware of is that you have your inner layer here, right at the edge of the bark, that is referred to as the cambium. And the cambium is special because the cambium is the only layer of the tree that is actually really alive. This is the area that's producing all of the new wood cells. This is where cell division is actually occurring. This is where cellular metabolism is actually happening. This is where the tree is actually alive. The rest of the tree is either cells are being pushed out from the cambium here, or they're, so some cells can be dead cells pushed outward for for example, the bark. But then interior is all cambium cells that used to be alive, or previous cambium cells that used to be alive, but are now dead. And then within this, you have basically two distinct layers. And where you actually draw the line can be difficult to say. I'll go ahead and label it, maybe about here. But again, like I said, it can be difficult to define where exactly this begins and ends. but you end up with two types of wood. I could draw the line here, or I might draw it here. I'm just gonna split the difference on this drawing and call it somewhere in the middle. But you end up with the sapwood, and as you go interior, you'll get the heartwood. So the main points of note, or the main places of note to be aware of, are the cambium, the bark, the sapwood, and the heartwood. And then at the very center, you have the pith of the tree. So again, a tree grows from the inside out. The pith is the location of the original sapling, or the original center point of the tree, and then everything slowly grows up layer by layer around it. And the primary difference between the sapwood and the heartwood is age, of course, but they also serve a fundamentally different structural difference in a living tree. The sapwood is called that because, well, that has a lot of sap in it, and sap is the tree's medium for transferring nutrients about it via osmotic mechanisms. And basically the sapwood is used for water transport in the tree. So the tree is needs to transport nutrients up and down itself, whether it's energy and food and such that are forming in the leaves, bringing that down, or bringing water and nutrients up from the soil. But trees need to be able to move nutrients around them. And again, they don't do that via a circulatory system. There are no heart and lungs in trees, but there are osmotic and other sort of similar mechanisms that are used to move material around trees. Now, so again, the primary difference between the heartwood and the sapwood is that the sapwood is the transportation layer of the tree. This is sort of the tree's superhighway, where it moves all of its materials either up or down as needed. And that sapwood then feeds nutrients to the cambium, which is responsible for all actual active cell growth. But then the heartwood at the center of the tree, this is only for structural purposes. And the reason the heartwood is actually so much darker than the sapwood is that as a layer dies off, as a layer transitions from sapwood to heartwood, chemicals are released called various preservative chemicals are released, and these serve to protect the tree's core against rot, bugs, things like that. And that's not of course always done perfectly, but the goal is to protect the tree against microbial and insect and fungal invasions. But when the tree is alive, in the layer of the tree that is actually alive, it can rely on biological mechanisms to actually to fight those off to some extent. But once it's inside the heartwood, there is no more living tree there, so the only way for the tree to defend against intrusion there, and termites and things like that, is via chemical resistance. So as the cambium moves out, it deposits chemicals inside the old dying wood, and those then, basically as the cambium cells die off, they release chemicals that serve as preservatives in the wood, in the interior wood, and that is why you end up with darker wood inside the interior of the tree. That is your that darker color is preservative chemicals released by the actively growing cells as they die off and the sort of growth wave moves outward. Next, I want to come back to this discussion, this point of discussion that I mentioned previously. Again, a tree starts off as something like this. At least a walnut tree does. A tree will start off as something like this and end up with something like this. This you can hold in the palm of your hand. This, obviously not. So I want you to just think to yourself, where does all that matter come from? How do we go from this to this? This one can actually be trickier than you might think if you don't already know the answer. This is actually something that can frequently stump people. Trees are living organisms, but they are not magic. They are not magical. And we know from the laws of physics and chemistry that matter and mass must be preserved, unless you're dealing with some sort of nuclear reaction, and trees thankfully are not involved in atomic reactions. That would be very bad indeed if trees were That would be a very scary world indeed if trees were practicing nuclear fission. I don't want to live in that world. But again, trees are very interesting, complex organisms, but they are not magical. And as such, they have to obey all the laws of conservation of energy, conservation of mass, etc. that anything else in our universe does. So, where does all of this matter come from? A walnut or a seed has very little mass, a large tree has a large amount of mass, and where does this come from? Now, you're probably aware that trees are powered by sunlight like all plants, but many people are still tempted to say, okay, well, all of that matter probably comes from the ground. You have water coming up through the roots, you have minerals from the soil, maybe they're just a giant soil nutrient gathering machine that's solar powered. And that is something some people think, and yes, trees do get a few of their trace nutrients from the soil, but they don't actually use that for the bulk of their material. And yes, they do get water from the soil and from transpiration and things, but water is a good portion of their overall mass, but that is more of a medium than the bulk of their structural support. Where do the solid parts of a tree come from? If it's not coming from the soil, well, it has to come from somewhere. So, if not from the soil, where do trees exactly get their mass? Well, I'd like to introduce you to someone named John Baptist von Helmund, and he was an early modern or perhaps late Renaissance scientist and author and sort of all-around, you might say, Renaissance man, who lived from 1580 to 1644 in the city of Brussels in what is now Belgium. Now, he did many things, including coined the term gas in the context of atmospheric gases, and is regarded as the father of pneumatic chemistry, which is like, if you remember to Boyle's law and those kinds of fundamental chemistry laws, he was actually the precursor to a lot of that. But oh man, you gotta love that outfit. But anyway, he one of the many things he did was he was wondering where trees got their mass, just like I'm discussing here. And just as some people today think, it was common at his time for a lot of people to believe that, including among scientists and biologists, that trees must get their mass from the soil. So what he did was he went and, in this very famous experiment, he went and obtained a small tree, a small, not a seed, but a small sapling, maybe, a foot high or something like that, weighed the sapling, then he put it in a large pot he took a large pot, filled it full of soil, and weighed the pot with the soil with no tree in it. So he knew the weight of the pot with soil in it. Then he took that sapling and planted it in the pot. Then he tended to the tree, let it grow for a few years, adding nothing but water. He didn't add any new fertilizer, he did not add any new compounds or any mulch or anything to the soil. He used only, all he did was give it water, and obviously outside so it could access sunlight, and afterwards he removed the tree from the pot, weighed the tree, and also weighed the pot. And what he determined was that the weight of the soil and the pot hadn't changed at all. They were exactly the same as before, while of course the tree had greatly grown in mass. So, doing so, he conclusively proved that trees do not get their mass from the soil, rather they have to get it from somewhere else. And if you think about it, there is only one possible place for trees to get their mass, as long as they're ruling out the possibility that they magically generate mass from nothing. They're magical mass-creating machines. Obviously, if they can't get mass from the soil, the only other place available to them is the air. And that is the case. Trees fundamentally get their mass from the air. So, trees get their mass from the air, and they're powered by sunlight, as you may have been familiar, or probably familiar, or can just remember from grade school biology. But obviously everything I've been talking about here is a gross simplification, but one final simplification is that from the point of view of a structural engineer, a tree can be thought of as a relatively simple machine, or simple device. And what a tree basically does is take carbon dioxide plus sunlight and convert it into wood. And of course, that is an absolute gross oversimplification. But again, for our purposes, this is fundamentally what a tree is. Trees gather CO2 from the air, they power it via sunlight gathered by the leaves, and then they use that energy to convert carbon dioxide and, of course, trace nutrients from the soil, water, etc. is all important in this process. But they use that to construct their own solid matter. And that is ultimately what trees are. You can sort of think of trees as distilled and frozen carbon dioxide, if that's one way that you want to look at it. Of course, all of this is very simplified, but for our point of view, and when we're discussing things like carbon sequestration and the use of wood as a sustainable building material, this is very important. Because unlike some other building materials that release carbon dioxide during the manufacturing process, like, say, concrete and steel, wood, by its very nature, is created directly from atmospheric carbon dioxide. So instead of, when you take wood and use it in a building, instead of releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, you are actually gathering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sequestering it inside of a building. Now, there is one very important consequence of trees being living organisms. Perhaps the most important consequence is they, like all living things, are subject to the law of natural selection. Every tree species that exists only exists now because it survived the 4 billion year deep corpse pile known as Darwin's ladder. In a natural forest environment, trees are under enormous pressure for resources. They are constantly competing against each other for space, including access to water and, most importantly, sunlight. Every tree is trying to outcompete every other tree, and those that fail die. Oh, and they're also doing this while trying to keep themselves from literally being eaten alive by insects, fungi, and bacteria. You'll never look at a forest the same way again. A key consequence of evolutionary biology is that there's no such thing as free lunch. Everything comes at a price, and namely, that price is energy. Every joule of energy that goes into growing structural support in a tree is a joule that cannot go into other purposes, such as growing new seeds. Every joule of energy used to transport material through a tree is a joule that can't go into things such as root growth. Every single aspect of a tree's biology has been optimized over countless generations of ruthless natural selection. And so, this has created some very interesting traits in trees that ultimately have a lot of impact on their use as a structural material. So, let's think of a tree as we would as a structure, a building, a tower, whatever kind of structure you're designing. Let's look at a tree as structural engineers. So, when designing any structure, the first question you have to ask is what kind of forces does it have to resist? Before we can design a structure, we need to know what kind of forces we have to combat. So, let's see. So what kind of forces does a tree have to resist? Well, the first and most obvious one is probably gravity. So, a tree of course has mass, and it's on the surface of the earth, so it experiences gravitational force and acceleration, so a tree has weight. And the only way for that weight to is to be delivered or deposited in the ground is for the trunk to carry all of that weight downward. So it has to be able to carry weight, which means that the tree trunk must be capable of carrying longitudinal forces. Then, what other kind of forces? Well, the other main force that a tree has to be able to resist is lateral force, and in particular wind. Now, I suppose trees in certain areas might have to resist a lot of earthquake, but trees don't really experience earthquake that often, or large earthquake loads. They tend to just, that kind of thing tends to be taken care of by their wind capacity. So, trees, but the main thing is they have to be able to resist wind, because, again, trees are constantly competing against each other for access to resources, in particular sunlight, which means it behooves them to grow as tall as they possibly can to outcompete other trees. Because if there's a shorter tree next to you, do draw some red happy trees. If there's a shorter tree next to this one, another big one over here, this small tree is not going to be able to get any sunlight. All the sunlight is going to be taken up by the taller trees. So it behooves trees to go as high as possible. The one downside of that is that, or one of the main downsides of that, is that the higher you go, the stronger your wind force is, both because winds tend to be stronger further up from the ground. The higher up you go from the ground, the greater the wind velocity. But also, if you think back to statics and basic mechanics, the longer the tree trunk, the longer the moment arm. So trees must be able to resist the downward force from this, but also the force of wind, and that does two things. It introduces a shear force in the trunk and branches, but it also introduces a moment. So trees must be able to overcome these forces, and as we've mentioned, trees are highly optimized. They are optimized by evolutionary processes, and structural strength requires energy. You have to put in cellular growth energy in order to produce strength in any direction. And so if a tree doesn't have a lot of forces in a certain direction in nature, it will not retain that tree species will not retain the ability to resist those forces, simply because there isn't a lot of evolutionary pressure for them to do so. So, for example, if you look at a tree trunk, the primary way that tree is going to be loaded is axially. It needs to resist this great weight coming down, which means it will be able to resist a great deal of weight axially. However, if I were to then try to compress it, if you have a tree trunk and you were to compress it this way, that's a kind of force that doesn't really happen very much in nature. It's hard to imagine something that would come along and squeeze the like a big bear hug type thing, giving a tree enormous compression or tension in the opposite direction. So a tree doesn't really need a lot of strength in perpendicular to its grain, at least in terms of compression, but it does in terms of axially. And what about tension? Well, a tree does need axial strength and tension, because if you have layers of a tree like this in a tree's trunk, in order for this thing to carry bending moment from the wind force, some of the fibers must go into compression and some of them must go into tension. So some have to be in compression and some have to go into tension, and that's what's going to provide the couple and thus the moment resistance to resist the overturning moment produced by wind and other lateral forces. So because of that, in order for the tree fibers to go into tension, they need to have a large amount of axial tensile capacity. So bearing in mind that wood needs to be able to resist primarily longitudinal forces, and that it needs to be able to transport material up and down its trunk, through its limbs, etc., it should be no surprise that when you zoom in at the microstructure level, you end up seeing structures kind of like this. So these are, one a drawing, one an actual image of the microstructure of various types of wood. So you can see here that you have very thin cells that are then stretched out or grow longitudinally. Wood cells are not round like you might have or approximately spherical like you might have in an animal etc. In a tree, the wood cells are very long and tubular, and that allows transport of material both within and between the cells, up and through the main trunk of the tree. And because the cell walls are positioned longitudinally, the cell walls are what provide a great deal of the strength in the material, you end up with a great deal of longitudinal strength. I always found this is really interesting, that this is what trees look like at the microstructure level. In effect, you can sort of think of a tree as a bundle of straws, and that's a metaphor that we're going to come back to again and again in this course, is that if you want to think of the structure of a tree, imagine a large bundle of straws bonded together. So taking this analogy further, again, we can think of trees as a large bundle of straws. And these straws, the direction of them is what gives the distinctive wood grain patterns we see in lumber. Additionally, we need to talk about what actually bonds them together. So, taking this analogy further, we have the individual cells and the spaces between the cells forming the straws in the straw-like bundle. What actually binds them together? Well, wood cells are long and longitudinal, they're very long cells, but between them is a compound or series of compounds referred to as lignin, and lignin is what bonds one wood cell to another. So the very strong wood cell wall is what provides that very high longitudinal or axial strength, and the lignin is what binds all of those long straws together and also provides your strength in the transverse or perpendicular directions. So, combining what we've learned about the microstructure of wood and how trees grow from the inside out, we can now talk about really how this impacts the structural strength of wood as a material. So, perhaps the primary difference between wood and some other materials, I'll use steel as an example, is that steel, if you remember back to mechanics, you may remember the word isotropic. Iso meaning the same, tropic direction. Steel is isotropic. It has the same material properties in all directions. Meanwhile, wood is orthotropic. Steel is isotropic and wood is orthotropic. So because of the way it grows, wood is going to have different properties in different directions. And we can split this up a couple of ways, but I'm going to describe this direction, moving outward from the center of a tree trunk, as radial. As radial. And this direction, maybe I'll draw that more curved, as tangential. And then into or out of the page is longitudinal. Now, as we've discussed, wood, or in particular trees, they primarily need longitudinal strength. So it shouldn't surprise us, again, because nothing is free in evolution. Everything takes energy. There's no such thing as a free lunch. It should not surprise us that trees and wood in general our wood is a material that is much stronger in the longitudinal direction than in the radial direction or in the tangential direction. Structural strength in living organisms costs energy. And since wood requires, or trees require, more longitudinal strength than tangential or radial strength, that carries forward into the wood as an actual final product. Because when we go and actually cut out a board, we end up cutting out something like this. This is what a cutaway of a board would look like. This is what the cross-section would look like. And we end up with, you could cut a board out with the length of the board going this way, but you obviously wouldn't end up with a very long piece of lumber, because trees grow in long, straight, or reasonably straight sections, or reasonably straight forms. So if you cut them out, if you tried to cut something out like this, you wouldn't get a very long piece of lumber. Instead, we cut things out like this, with the length of the board running along the length of the trunk, or if it was a particularly large branch, maybe along the length of the branch. So what that does is, just as the tree trunk has a greater strength in the longitudinal direction, that will translate to the final properties of our actual building material. If this were, for example, a 2x4, that 2x4 will end up having a much greater strength if you try to pull it or compress it in the longitudinal direction than if you were to try and pull or compress it, put it under tension or compression in the radial or the longitudinal direction. Also, you sometimes see this tangential referred to as the hoop direction, although in particular in wood design, we don't tend to actually separate out the radial and the tangential. if you're actually looking at the actual strength of the wood in detail, there is difference in strength between the radial and tangential, but both of them are very small in relation to the longitudinal direction. And especially because when we actually cut out lumber, we end up with shapes that form various angles relative to the circumference of the grain. We tend to split things into just two directions. We have parallel and perpendicular. Again, because longitudinal is the direction where the primary strength lies, we just refer to this, we use one strength value for tension, compression, etc. that is parallel to the grain, and we use a different value for perpendicular to grain. Because wood is cut, because actual boards are cut at varying angles in relation to the grain, in practical cases, or not in relation to the grain, sorry, in relation to the growth rings, we can't effectively separate out tangential and radial directions, so instead we just group them together as perpendicular. So as we go through the course, we're going to see a lot of mechanical properties of lumber, but we're always going to break them down into parallel and perpendicular values. Now there's a few more things I want to talk about in terms of general properties of wood. You know, these are just relating to how trees grow, some topics that come up when discussing lumber and wood, etc. So the first thing that should be discussed is, first of all, where the actual rings in a tree's cross-section come from. Now, you've probably heard before that you can determine the age of a tree by counting the number of rings, and that is largely true depending on where you are. In temperate climates, in areas that have very distinct seasons, whether it's fall, winter, summer, spring, or whether you're talking about wet season, dry season, depending where you are in the world, any area that has very distinct seasonal changes, when you cut trees open or cut them down in those regions, you will find that they grow distinct ring patterns, and that is as a direct response to the environment around them. So what trees do is they go through annual growth cycles, and each ring is created by a single ring's growth cycle. And of course, trees are highly variable. They do not grow in perfect circles. They don't grow in perfectly symmetric, or not perfectly symmetric, in perfectly uniform layers. The thickness of each layer changes as each year comes along. They grow in non-symmetric manner, in non-symmetric directions. They are living things, and they can be lumpy. They can have knots in them. They can have cracks in them. They can have all sorts of interesting defects that we'll talk about in another lecture. But again, the key thing to keep in mind is that 1 year's growth corresponds to 1 ring, and the differences between each ring correspond to the amount of materials available to the tree in that year. The amount of nutrients available, the amount of sunlight available, the amount of water especially that's available. So generally the larger the ring, the more successful that particular year was for the tree. So in fact, actually, there's a whole field called paleoclimatology where they try to go or scientists try to go and determine what a region's particular climate was like, simply by finding some very old trees and measuring the various growth rings. And by doing that, you can actually determine, on a particularly very old tree, you could cut that tree down or take a core sample or something and look at it and say, oh look, in the year 1200 AD or whatever, this region must have had a very big drought because this tree had very thin rings, or had a very thin ring in that particular year. You can actually deduce things about the climate, and also things by climate I mean things like temperature, rainfall, etc., based on tree borings. But that's another field entirely. Finally, I'd just like to talk about the difference between two terms that you've probably heard before, and those two terms are hardwood and softwood. So hardwood and softwood, you hear these particularly in woodworking circles and that sort of thing, but many people don't actually have a precise definition of what the difference between hardwood and softwood is. Now, the interesting thing about hardwood versus softwood is that it actually has nothing to do with the mechanical hardness of the wood at all. It has nothing to do with the strength, it has nothing to do with the hardness. Rather, when we refer to something as hardwood, we mean that it is a deciduous tree. So maple, or sorry, this is not maple, this is walnut. Walnut is an example of a deciduous tree, meaning that it's a tree found in temperate regions, or it is a tree that grows and loses leaves every year. So I'm sure you've all seen this before, at least if you live in a temperate region that goes through seasonal cycles. Deciduous trees or hardwood trees, they grow new leaves every year. In the fall, they turn brown or orange, they make pretty colors, and then they fall to the ground, decompose, etc. In contrast, softwood are your evergreen trees. These are trees that do not go seasonal. They do not go through seasonal changes in leaves. In fact, they don't even have leaves. They have needles, very thin leaf-like structures, but they're not really leaves at all. They're needles. I'm sure you've seen pine needles before. So again, hardwood versus softwood has nothing to do with the actual hardness of the wood. Instead, they deal only with the type of tree it is. Hardwoods are going to be your deciduous trees, and softwoods are going to be your evergreen trees. Here I have two pieces of wood, cut perpendicular to the grain to reveal their grain structure. The straw-like characteristics of the wood can clearly be seen. You can see the straw-like characteristics here, all these little interior spaces, all these little straws that you can see in the microstructure. In terms of species, the wood at the top is black walnut, and the wood at the bottom is Douglas fir. And in terms of groups of wood, black walnut is, like all walnut, is a hardwood species, and Douglas fir is, like all firwood, is a softwood species. Now, a few things to note. First of all, note that the Douglas fir below has much larger growth rings than the hardwood walnut wood here. Look at this. One growth ring goes from here to here on the Douglas fir, while on the black walnut here, it goes from about maybe here to here. You have much wider growth rings, especially towards over here. You're getting very narrow growth rings here and a bit over here. And so this illustrates because of this, you can see one of the key differences between hardwood and softwood. In the same given area or same given volume, however you want to look at it, hardwoods will have many more rings than in the equivalent amount of area for softwoods. Softwoods have much wider rings, and hardwoods have narrower rings. And in turn, this means that hardwoods tend to be much denser than softwoods. Now, of course, all of this, there's going to be exceptions, but as a general rule, hardwoods tend to be denser. Now, there are some consequences to that. Despite what I said earlier, the name hardwood is not entirely mistaken. As a general rule, hardwoods do tend to be harder and stronger than softwoods. However, there are many exceptions. So you can't just take a hardness or a strength measurement of a wood and say, of a sample of wood and say, oh, this species is hardwood or softwood. There are some softwoods that are in fact very hard. I mean this in terms of mechanical hardness. But as a general rule, hardwoods are in fact actually harder than softwoods. So let's think about this though. We know that hardwoods will in general tend to be stronger than softwoods. So which do you think we use in construction and structural contexts? Now, you might think that we would use hardwoods. After all, more strength is better, right? For the same cross-sectional area in a square inch of cross-section, as a general rule, we're going to get more strength out of hardwoods than we will out of softwoods. However, if you've been in a construction site, you've probably never seen someone try to frame a building out of black walnut. That is something, I don't know, an eccentric millionaire or multi-millionaire, eccentric, that's something to do when you're an eccentric billionaire who's just trying to flaunt their wealth or something, because to frame an entire house in something like black walnut would be obscenely expensive, even just a modest-sized house, let alone a giant one. No, in construction, we tend to use softwoods. So it is true again that you do get more strength out of the same amount of material in hardwoods than in softwoods, but ultimately that doesn't matter. Just look at and why is that? Look at the number of growth rings again. So this here, if I go back here, okay, nope, let's erase that. Let's count the number of growth rings. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 growth rings to go across the length of the board. Let's look here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It can be we'd actually have to prepare the sample a bit more to count the number of growth rings, but a conservative estimate, we can see that in a given area, this piece of lumber this piece of wood has easily twice the number of growth rings in the same area as this piece of fir. And it's key to remember that each ring represents 1 year's growth. Each ring represents 1 year's growth. So that means that a softwood like Douglas fir is able to grow much more wood in one season, or in one growth season, in 1 year, than hardwood will. So yes, the final product will be stronger per unit area with the hardwood than the softwood, but the softwood more than makes up for it by being so quick and rapid to grow. Most wood especially wood for construction projects, is grown on tree farms, which are like tree plantations that are just used, basically tree farms, you grow trees on them like you would corn or any other crop. You have long rows of trees and they grow for, 5, 10, 20 years, whatever the species and local conditions are. And then you simply harvest them at the end of the cycle and replant and start all over again. So, with softwoods, you're able to get much more wood out of a given plot of land in a given amount of time. And so even though hardwoods tend to be stronger per unit area, softwoods just grow so rapidly that they more than make up for it. So yes, you might be able to get hardwoods may be stronger, but if you have to wait centuries for a hardwood tree to grow to a substantial size, or if you have to wait 50 years or something, you're generally going to be better off growing softwoods for 10 years or 20 years than you would growing hardwoods for 50 or 100 years. So that is why we don't tend to use that's why we don't tend to use hardwoods almost at all in construction structural purposes, simply because they take too long to grow. We're better off using a greater quantity of the weaker softwood than we are in using a smaller quantity of the higher quality hardwoods. So in applications such as fine woodworking, you will see a lot of hardwoods. Like I mentioned, I do some woodworking on the side, and I use a lot of hardwoods in my projects. But we don't tend to use hardwoods in construction simply because of their high cost. Hardwoods are reserved for things like furniture, primarily furniture, things like in addition to furniture, you might have things like cutting boards and other domestic uses, but you don't tend to see hardwoods in construction simply because of the high cost. And that high cost comes directly from the time it takes for hardwood to grow. If hardwood grew as fast and as rapidly as softwoods, we would probably only use hardwoods for construction. But because they take so long to grow, in most cases we are better off using softwoods in construction, because in construction the primary motivator is cost rather than just strength per unit area. Alright, well, I definitely have much more I can talk about, and I will have much more to talk about in later lectures. That's going to have to do it for today. So, I hope you enjoyed this introduction to the growth properties of wood, how trees grow and develop, and how some of those characteristics transfer to the final properties of wood in civil and structural contexts. So, again, I hope you found this interesting and enjoyable, or I hope you've at least learned something. If you like what you saw, please feel free to like, subscribe, and make a comment to make the robots happy. If you'd like to support the channel as you can, feel free to click on the link below and see our page on Patreon. If you do need a copy of the text that I'll be referencing or a copy of the NDS code, feel free to see the referral links in the comments below or in the description below. Now, I am pleased to announce that we do have our first channel patron, and that is Logan Patrick, who is supporting the channel each month with a donation through Patreon. If you are able to support the channel, I know obviously many people are students here, and I know obviously the costs of education are not small. I'm a student myself. I am aware of that, fully aware, all too aware of that. But every little bit helps if you can and are able, and of course it is greatly appreciated. So again, we do have our first channel patron, that is Logan Patrick, and I have to say thank you. But regardless, I hope you found this enjoyable and interesting. I hope you get to see you all again soon for the next lecture in this video series, and as always, thank you.